So harm, as I mentioned in the paper, nuclear testing has been intergenerational and remains a contemporary threat to Pacific communities, harm in the broader sense to their waters, to their lands, and to their bodies, in the words of one Marshall Islands senior officials. Nuclear justice, really in terms of the paper and how I put it forward, it's really about accountability. It is about genuine remorse. It is about admission and owning the multitude of harm people and their communities have suffered. With all the global advancements of the myriad of frameworks on rights, justice, and freedom, how is it that Pacific communities are still fighting to be free from the effects of nuclear?
Justice, in terms of the experience of the Pacific Islands and especially the Marshall Islands, in my study, is basically the reclaiming or the restoring of the humanity and the human dignity of people who are affected by problem or the challenges of nuclear testing. Nuclear testing was one of the very deliberate way of doing experimentations on people, and communities were dislocated as a result of the explosions and tremendous destruction to the environment. It's a historical issue that needs to be corrected through monetary, but in most instances, the psychological and the emotional trauma that people said to undergo. The stigma of being considered nuclear test subjects is something that people in certain places of the world really need to seek the humanity in. So that's basically from a psychological and emotional nature of nuclear justice.
We can think of nuclear justice from different angles and different perspectives when we look at the challenges now created and to which Pacific Island countries are exposed to due to climate change. Have similar issues with loss of land, issues around mobility that happened throughout the nuclear testing era, issues around inhabitability of land. And one thing, of course, also what I'm in my own work I'm looking at is from the perspective of reparative or corrective justice, that when these nuclear harms have occurred, how can we remedy the harms to the victims, and in this case again to the Pacific peoples that have been exposed and subjugated to nuclear testing by the nuclear powers. So then we look at important legal and ethical questions of what is sufficient remedy. Can we somehow restitute those harms from the past? Much of the conversation has related to around compensations, and then we have questions of rehabilitation, both of the people and the land and environment. And then we have the final, in terms of reparative corrective justice, we have the question of what is satisfactory measures, right? How do we define the satisfaction in this case?
It's well documented, it's well acknowledged also that the people and the successive governments of the Marshallese governments have been actively pursuing nuclear justice, of course, with the United States. And Marshall Islands also has put forward a nuclear justice strategy. They've established a national nuclear commission. And with that strategy, they've outlined 5 pillars that they see nuclear justice, works for them from the perspective of compensation, healthcare, environment, and national capacity, as well as education and awareness. At a regional level, though, is where also wider action has happened in terms of nuclear justice. And the genesis of the Pacific Islands Forum, one of the genesis in the establishment of that forum was the issue of nuclear testing, to stop nuclear testing. So really, the nuclear testing and the opposition to nuclear has been in the DNA of Pacific Islands for a very, very long time. And I think the whole genesis is that at the national level, the countries that have been directly impacted. They've been pursuing dialogue, they've been pursuing the international fora engagement with this issue, not forgetting this issue and the justice for them.
Nuclear justice was very much built into the 1980s regional consciousness of Papua New Guineans. In the 1980s, during the height of the anti-nuclear movement in the Pacific, on the campus of the University of Papua New Guinea, Melanesian Solidarity, one of our NGOs, non-government organizations, was able to build solidarity with a lot of Pacific Islanders and other Melanesian countries to push for the banning of nuclear testing in places like French Polynesia. So we grew up hearing about all these activists and people who were taking an active role in trying to shine a light on the nuclear testing that was happening in our region. And the exemplary kinds of way of conducting civil disobedience and actively participating in influencing government policy towards the banning of nuclear weapons. We read about these things, and it's something that we take great pride in understanding how Pacific Islanders can mobilize around a certain agenda that has direct implications for their security and for the peace of the region.
Obviously, we know about the attempts under the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons taken, especially by countries like Kazakhstan and Kiribati, to try to really elevate the Articles 6 and 7 that look at the obligations of states to provide assistance and rehabilitation for the victims of nuclear testing and territories and peoples. So within TPNW framework, there's obviously kind of in those internal discussions, but as many often argue, is that because the treaty is currently still covering only less than half of the world's states and none of the nuclear power states, it's of course the questions of fairness and justice come to play again, because it seems from the perspective of ethics slightly unfair that the territories that have already obliged themselves and countries that have obliged themselves prohibition of nuclear weapons then among themselves have to share the burdens of rehabilitation and compensation and obligations towards those humanitarian goals of the treaty when they have not played any role in the occurrence in the first place. But that's where, of course, the kind of realities of world politics come to play.
So many frameworks around how to address this. One of my recommendations is I took how about we start implementing some of this? These are not silent. This shouldn't be silent arrangement. This shouldn't be silent, and there shouldn't be a selective approach to which rights we champion, which rights we go silent on. Because it seems to me that if there is accountability, it's like everybody shies away from that notion of accountability. One of the mechanisms could be a dialogue between Asia Pacific that could be set out specifically to look at this issue. There are so many common threads about it, but what could be, probably as together the voices would be stronger about making the actions. What are some of the actions that can be both beneficial for both regions in the countries? Because, like I said, 77 years, the Pacific is still fighting. Maybe having a voice together with the Asia may be able to have more weight. If we look at climate change, there is an alliance of small island states that includes the Caribbean islands that have been quite powerful in leading on climate change issues and climate justice issues. So perhaps that's the kind of model that I'm looking at. Maybe that is a model that could be, some of that practice could be transferred over to a nuclear justice issue for both Asia and the Pacific.
The collaboration that is needed to create a critical mass of informed citizens across all countries. This particular issue is not, the nuclear justice is not just about those who are directly affected by nuclear testing or who previously were impacted by nuclear testing and the destruction of nuclear weapons. It concerns every citizen who is potentially in the fear or in the theater of a potential great power conflict. We should push for nuclear justice because we are reminding all these great powers who are nuclear harmed that if war or conflict is to happen, it does not matter whether you are nuclear harmed or you're not nuclear harmed, or whether you're outside or you're inside the alliance systems of these two states, of these two great powers. We are all going to be affected in one way or another by the fallout and the very destructive nature of this technology. I think there's a generation of academics and scholars should really be using nuclear justice as the basis to start writing and contributing to the knowledge to create informed citizens who vote and who make decisions and influence their leaders. So there's a certain level of complacency now in the minds of leaders in the Asia Pacific about the destructive nature of nuclear weapons. That is the nature of the region we're in. So it's evidence-based kind of research and using the testimonies of people who are affected by nuclear weapons, and all these are very actual information that can shape the thinking of our leaders, but also get informed citizens to make sure that the leaders are acting in accordance with the wishes of the people.
A colleague and friend of mine, Thomas Doyle, a few years ago published a great book called Nuclear Ethics in the 21st Century. And there he kind of looks at how can we come with a justice front in the debates that much of relates to security and order of international politics. And he raises some important things like the continuous stigmatization of nuclear weapons, that it's not okay to threaten the world with nuclear weapons after we know what kind of destruction they form. Also, importance of supporting civil society organizations, right, and supporting those grassroots activists and elevating those voices that talk about nuclear legacy and talk about the still continuous harm that is present in the region and within the populations that were victims of either use of nuclear weapons or the nuclear testing. Of course, we see that population is quickly dying away because of the decades that sense of these harms, but we also at the same time know that the consequences in environment, for instance, are still there, and some of them are gonna be with us for a very long time. And I think also putting pressure especially on the allies of the nuclear weapon states to kind of really understand the kind of how important it is that also those that do not have nuclear weapons do show either explicit or implicit support for these powers, because obviously that justifies or legitimizes that great power. Great power is a bit maybe outdated term, but that kind of great power, nuclear power contestation.